Hey there, guys! Today we've got a brand new story for you, a story that's a little different from the others. This time, we're bringing a slightly unusual reincarnation. Imagine this. You're at the peak of your life, at the height of your prime, 55 years old. You might think, I'll retire now, take it easy. All that's left is to wait for death. But then you realize you don't even have the money to rest for a single day. Instead, you're stuck in dangerous situations like this one, fighting against powerful monsters. Sitting on a rock, he stares into the distance, lost in thought. He even wonders what happened to him. At 55, he had imagined he would be by a fireplace, in a peaceful place, just watching time pass. But no, here he is, facing off against these monsters. His whole life he was a failure, and it seems these creatures won't even let him catch his breath. Right in front of him, 3 monstrous heads emerge. He sighs and slowly gets up, lazily stretching. He just wanted to rest for a bit and take in the fresh air, but it's no use. The creatures have already surrounded him. The moment they spot him, all the dragons in the area charge at him, aiming to bite him. The protagonist, weakened but not yet defeated, grips his sword tightly and moves toward them. Of course, he refuses to be left behind. After all, every player of his generation has been called the Sword Saint, the God of Swords, or some other grand title. But to everyone else, he was just an old man with a sword. At best, a mere swordsman. That was the only recognition he ever got for his past fights against formidable monsters. And even that wasn't enough. Now, let's go back a few years. There he was, face to face with a monster gripping his sister by the head. At that moment, he could do nothing. Kneeling, he watched as his teacher was held by the creature as well, blood dripping from her wounds. Even in that dire state, she begged him not to be afraid. His teacher was still alive, for now. She only asked him to run, but just as she spoke, something red and suspiciously liquid-like splattered through the air toward him. In the end, he saw his orphanage teacher leaving him behind as he lay on the ground. Not far from him, another mutant monster bared its massive fangs, ready to devour someone else. He saw them all, his fellow orphans, familiar faces, falling one by one. They were all killed by these monsters. Everyone he knew was gone. The scene shifts. In the sky, a great crack appears. A portal opens, and from within, creatures from another world begin pouring out. These monsters invade the world, utterly destroying everything in their path. And among them, the protagonist, now just a boy, was held tightly by one of the creatures. They took everything from him. Yet even in this terrifying moment, he did not despair. He wasn't even afraid, because just then, at the end of the tunnel, a light appeared. As he narrated this beautiful story, the scene shifts once more. Now, in the present, the protagonist grips his massive sword. With one final move, he slices the monster's head off in a single strike. In the past, he was saved by that person. Now, in the future, he wanted to become like them. To do that, he fought relentlessly, facing countless monsters. But in the end, what was the point? It didn't matter how many orcs he slaughtered, how many battles he won. He could kill 1,000,000 monsters, but in the end, he never truly became strong. He failed. He failed to become the hero he once idolized. On the battlefield, he looked around. His comrades lay scattered on the ground, defeated. He cursed himself. He hadn't even been able to protect a single person. And so, he fell. He could do nothing now. Nothing except scream and hope that something, anything, would change. But nothing did. And so we return to the beginning, where it all started. A knight. With her sword, she sliced through the monsters, cutting them to pieces. And as the creature holding him collapsed, the boy fell to his knees, thinking he was about to die. But then, someone appeared. That person turned to him and asked if he was scared. And at that moment, he broke down in tears. And just like that, a miracle happened. The world began to awaken to new powers. Facing one of the powerful monsters, only after battling all those monsters does he become exhausted. With so many monsters, it almost killed him from exhaustion, but he is still standing strong. And after this whole story, he even wonders if you, the reader, understand what happened to the guy. Was this a tough job for him or not? It seems that even his body was trying to give up on him, and he couldn't continue. Otherwise, his lower back would be in pain. Sangwan now even thought that after killing these creatures, he could finally be heading home, until he suddenly heard a tremor. As soon as he hears this tremor, he looks ahead and sees a magnificent, more-than-giant dragon staring at him. He freezes, but, well, this is the question. Where was his home? Maybe everything that is happening is just a dream, but he wouldn't just stand there watching it all unfold, because that dragon opened its mouth, and from its mouth, a breath began to emerge. But now, stuck in place, with his spine completely shattered and in pain, he asks himself, and us, where did he go wrong to end up in this situation? His whole life was a failure, and at this moment, the only thing he could think about was a single way, just one way, to resolve this entire situation, a way to become strong enough, to go back to the past, like in other stories. The guy reincarnates with an extremely overpowered ability, because, with the vast knowledge he possesses, what if he returns to the past and becomes one of the most powerful knights in the world? Tang Ruan was a very dedicated man, and now, as we can see in the magnificent sunset, the dragon was easily defeated and slain by our protagonist. Only after bringing down that dragon does he shout aloud. He worked hard to get here. But why does he persist so much if, in the end, he doesn't even get anything in return? He is already at his breaking point, 55 years old, and it has been basically 30 years since he started living as an ESP. But his greatest achievement was being among the top 100 in his country. But to be truly honest, that basically meant he was just a needle in a haystack. Now that he has taken down the monster, he could move on with his life, until he turns around and finds a peculiar book right there in the middle of nowhere. The thing catches his attention. Curious, he approaches it. After all, the last time he did this, he ended up consuming some artifacts that made him immensely powerful. He even wonders if he can eat this one too. Thinking about eating the book, he suddenly sees a light coming from behind him. Only after that light appears does he turn around, and there, a screen appears, stating that the constellation Model Student Beginner has just entered a portal. Soon, a mysterious adventurer emerges from that portal. As the adventurer appears, he grabs the book from the ground, and then he praises the protagonist for his hard work. He also compliments the final strike he delivered to the beast. It was relentless, but the protagonist simply doesn't understand anything at all. He just thanks the constellation. At first, Sang Rare had no idea what that constellation meant, but now he is grateful that it made him one of the strongest Esperas in the world. But back to him, the system seems to be displaying that Sang Huan's total level is 600,500, and due to the insane conditions, he still hasn't been able to receive some benefits from the constellation. However, on the other hand, the constellation is overjoyed and asks the protagonist to take the initiative to eat the book. He was just talking about considering eating it, but after saying that he might devour it, the protagonist then raises his hand toward the book. Then, he declares that he will eat it. So he devours the artifact, and the only ability he awakened was rather weak. But to understand what ability he had awakened, he needed to boil and eat more artifacts. He even tried frying them to get a better taste. In the end, he didn't feel anything different. When he finally finished his useless experiments and placed his hand on the book again, he was surprised by the result. In that moment, he couldn't devour it. Many artifacts, good ones at that. 30 years had passed, and only now had he obtained an artifact of the proper classification for his abilities. And only now did he realize that his artifact-devouring ability had finally activated. In the end, he discovered this far too late, which had prevented him from growing stronger. Others became stronger as soon as they awakened their abilities, but now, as he looked at this book, he saw that there was nothing special about it. So he picked up the book and threw it to the ground. He needed some instructions on how to use it. The constellation of Leda ended up apologizing, saying that the book contained a lot of information, but could not be used at that moment. However, he also said that, after so long, he should be greeting him once again, and that he now needed to begin mana synchronization once more. He needed time. Turning to the constellation, his eyes filled with tears, he asked, "Time." The man was already on edge. Any minute, any sneeze, and he could die. But if by any chance he had some grandchildren, then he could pass all this power on to them. In the end, however, the constellation apologized again, saying that it was not possible. The protagonist simply replied that it was fine, but from the moment he was born until now, his life had been full of regrets. He even remembered that hunter who had come back to help him. He had tried his best to be just like him, but in the end, he had failed. Just another nobody like any other. At that moment, he was very old now. However, if he were just a little younger, he could still do something. The constellation then stopped to think, looking at the book before giving a faint smile. Moments later, we find the protagonist saying that there was no need to worry about such things. He was retiring. But the moment he said the word retire, the constellation extended its hand toward him. He didn't understand why the constellation was doing that, but his future self, from somewhere, commented that the scene he was witnessing now was the beginning. Now, even calling out to the constellation, he wondered what was happening. However, that was his last memory at the age of 55. In the end, it was revealed that the book he had just picked up used the essence of everything one had experienced in their life to give them another chance. He saw letters appearing, and soon after, the scene changed to a different location, in daylight. Someone was speaking, "The dungeons are the gates. These are basically the environments where people will awaken." He was John Park Ming. In other words, what he said was about becoming a player. Hang, on the other hand, agreed with him because they needed to refer to the dungeons as pathways for players. But the gates, they were dimensions. In other words, they connected to unknown regions. These regions were the places where players would begin to explore and become pioneers. All of this was being broadcast on TV. Sangwan, meanwhile, was simply watching everything. And with that, they kept wondering what was happening inside that dungeon. Time, well, they didn't know much about it. However, on the other side, the protagonist was already happy because he had truly returned from the future to the past. He now found himself in a situation that was almost normal. But to be more precise, he had gone back 30 years into the past. 3 days later, we see him in his room. He had lost consciousness when he was 55, and now, opening his eyes once again, he was here in his apartment, the studio where he had lived practically 30 years ago. Now in his room, he looked at the palm of his hand and realized that he was no longer a 55-year-old man. He was now a young man in his prime, at 25. No matter how hard he tried to figure out how he had managed to go back in time, part of it was most likely due to that constellation. It was very likely a miracle that had been granted to him, but that was something he didn't want to dwell on too much right now. Now, clenching his fist, he knew he had to enter the dungeon. The bad part was that the artifact he held in his hand was only bronze level. Its classification might be low, but on the other hand, he could use a hidden ability. Even though his mana absorption rate was low, he didn't care much about that. The most important thing was the hidden ability he possessed. At that moment, activating the ability, he entered his subconscious. This place where he found himself now was the place where he needed to go first in order to consume any kind of artifact he encountered. Whenever he entered this space, he felt anxious, and on the ceiling appears a meal. What appeared was that drug of his. He might be devouring this drug, only now it's in the shape of a chicken, and he's happy about it. After all, he even thought that you guys had aimed to troll him by sending him some kind of centipede for him to eat instead of this chicken. Well, here he takes a piece of it. Only after biting into it does he gain 2 agility points. He also gains the hidden ability, Demon Blast. But the dagger was also devoured. Now, this dagger will disappear forever for him. However, in exchange, he will receive something much better. And as soon as he devours it, he returns to his real world. In the real world, he feels sad to see that his ability ended up destroying that sword, but in return, he managed to obtain a unique skill. In the end, that was worth more than nothing, but now he needed to go to a certain portal. The scene cuts to another location. At this location, he finds himself in front of a gigantic portal. The protagonist entered with a group to clear this dungeon. The team leader then appears at this moment, with an extra calling out to him. As soon as he is called, he comments that one of his subordinates ended up quitting. He was one of the newly recruited members and didn't want to participate in this dungeon anymore. The leader tells him not to worry. Most likely, the guy will just join another player team. He doesn't understand why someone would want to leave the adventurer career to become a player. He gets furious that the leader let that guy leave his team. And to make things worse, the guy hadn't even finished Game Academy yet. Like it or not, that adventurer was part of his team. Now that he left, his team would be a bit unbalanced. But at this moment, the team leader approaches him in a completely non-threatening manner. He asks him to stay calm. After this non-threatening atmosphere, the doorman then leaves. As soon as he leaves, they start talking about a few things. Nothing interesting. Then, the protagonist is introduced, entering the scene and saying that he will be working with them today. For Sang Juan, this will be his first player test. And at the moment he says it's his first time, we see everyone's faces. The doormen already understand what's happening to him. Meanwhile, the players take on a slightly menacing look. Sang Juan approaches the portal more and more and notices the enormous pressure coming from it. He even wonders if these guys were trying to troll the protagonist inside the dungeon. Whether they were or not, they didn't hide their expressions. But finally, when they arrived, the leader approached with a happy face, thanking Sang Juan for joining his team. But the leader changes the subject and asks him what his weapon is. If it would be that spear there, that long weapon. The protagonist replies that yes, it is. After all, he studied on YouTube how to perform faster movements. The leader, on the other hand, comments that this weapon is difficult to use. But the protagonist replies that there's no need to worry. He can protect himself. Since the boy has a spirit, he shouts for everyone to get ready, as they are now about to enter the dungeon they just found. And as soon as he says this, all the players decide to enter the dungeon. After the last one enters, Sang Juan, we see from behind the leader, who doesn't understand what the protagonist is trying to do here. After all, studying how to use this long sword on YouTube, that was ridiculous. What he just said was basically total arrogance. Since it's his first time, he doesn't know the real danger inside the dungeon. But the leader doesn't worry, he knows what will happen inside. This is the dungeon of Zor. It was like a wall of lamentations for new rats. It was basically his territory. As soon as he entered, he smiled. But his smile turned to despair, because that stupid idiot was stronger than they had imagined. Everyone in the group is surprised as with just a few moves, he managed to take down each of these orcs. So now, he was wondering, who exactly was this guy? He stands in front of one of the superior orcs while sheathing his sword. The superior orc was killed with a single sword move of his, but to tell the truth, he had never even experienced anything like this before. This scene here left him quite surprised. While commenting on it, we came upon the dreadful hour, witnessing from our protagonist's perspective. Look, monsters appear mainly in games and movies and in fantasy settings, and for them, many already knew their power. Many even tend to be prejudiced against orcs because orcs are very weak. Of course, compared to other monsters like dragons. In exchange, they are weak but quite stupid and idiotic. That's why new players who are arrogant end up underestimating them, which is also their mistake. The characteristic of orcs is quite simple. On average, these orcs are 2.5 meters tall and weigh almost 200 kilograms, but their defining trait is simply strength. With a single hand movement, they can destroy any player, and for this reason, Zor is given the nickname the Lamenting Wall. Now, let's go back a few minutes. They were walking through this dungeon. As they moved through the dungeon, a player appeared, commenting so that the protagonist wouldn't get too happy because he wouldn't receive any bonuses. Besides, no one is kind to newbies. However, the protagonist said he would do his best until the player asked him not to do his best, but instead to do good. Knowing this, the protagonist then asks a rather unusual question, whether he could fight the monsters head-on. Until then, he wondered why he wanted to fight head-on, but he didn't have much time for an answer. Looking back, he is surprised by one of the orcs holding an axe. This might be his first battle since he returned. He would take care of it until, out of nowhere, a knight appeared. using his shield to defend himself from the orc's attack. Holding back the orc, he turns to the group and shouts at the protagonist, asking why he wanted so badly to fight this orc with such a huge sword. However, the protagonist interrupts him, saying that he only intended to help. But he is interrupted again, being told to do his best. Then, the knight asks him to watch closely, but before he can do anything, the orc makes another move, this time aiming directly at the adventurer. Then, out of nowhere, Rawl appears, and with a single motion, manages to push the orc backward, making it fall to the ground. Now that the orc is on the ground, he asks everyone to get organized, and so they do. At this moment, as they regroup, he warns them to be prepared because this guy was strong. The orc approaches again, but as it makes a move to attack, the leader uses his shield to defend himself. Only then does he grab his sword and thrust it into the orc. With this movement, he realizes that the sword got stuck inside the orc. The whole group finds this incredible, realizing that he finally managed to kill an orc with a single move. But suddenly, the orc becomes even more furious. Now enraged, the orc raises its sword high, aiming to strike down the leader. But it fails as the leader dodges. The protagonist simply watches everything. The team leader should be the one with the highest level, but he is only at level 50. Looking at him, it becomes clear that he can't even land a single proper hit on this monster. However, each of his moves makes the orc even angrier. Now furious, the orc charges forward and strikes a blow. This time, the hit lands, causing the orc to stumble and fall to the ground. The whole group realizes that perhaps it's finally over, that they have managed to kill the orc. As soon as they kill the orc, the leader loses all focus, turns to the group, and says that it was nothing. The group even thinks that the leader would be able to handle all the orcs in this place, but saying such a thing. Then, a roar is heard from deep within. That roar came from a massive horde of orcs emerging from a room. At that moment, seeing this enormous number of orcs, the entire group freezes in disbelief. They can't believe that so many orcs exist in this place. The leader, watching this, thinks they should retreat, as it would be best for the group's safety. However, the leader does not even know what level. He wouldn't even be able to fight against them until suddenly, the protagonist appeared in the background, saying that he could give it a try. Everyone was surprised. Some even began to think he was being too arrogant. The leader, on the other hand, upon hearing this, thought he was being an idiot. So he tried to give him some encouragement, telling him that he didn't need to, until the protagonist ran past him. Sang Juan advanced, while his group thought he had rushed ahead to get himself killed with his sword. But then, he made the only move. His first move, he managed to kill one of the orcs. However, there were still many more. But that alone was enough to leave his entire group in shock because Sang Juan had managed to defeat an orc. And the most incredible part of all was that, at this point, our protagonist was still at level 1. How could a level 1 guy kill such strong orcs? The orcs, upon hearing the protagonist's words, became irritated. They were offended that a mere level 1 warrior was standing up to them. And once they were face to face, they charged at the protagonist. At that moment, the protagonist revealed that he might be low level, but he had a lot of combat experience. And he proved it, because with a single sword strike, he not only cut through all the orcs in front of him, but he also managed to take them all down. But then, a stronger orc appeared. This one managed to strike down the protagonist, or so it thought. However, our protagonist dodged to the side. Sang Juan evaded the attack, then simply lifted his sword, clearly slicing off the orc's arm and continuing to cut through other parts, ultimately killing it. He then revealed that, as a kid, he used to wipe out orcs like these. His entire group was stunned to see that Sang Juan had actually defeated a high-level orc. At first, he had said he wanted to fight. And maybe what he said wasn't just a joke, but there was still one orc left. The protagonist prepared himself, for this next enemy was an armored orc. This orc, now angrier, approached the protagonist. Once he got close to Sang Hwan, he lifted his sword and attempted to strike, but the attack only hit the ground because Sang Hwan dodged it. In midair, the protagonist was already preparing his counterattack. The moment he was ready, he struck one of the orc's weak points. That single strike was enough to bring the orc down. After defeating this orc, the leader appeared. He was surprised to see that the protagonist had landed a blow on the orc's most resistant area, which was why the attack hadn't worked completely. The orc prepared to attack the protagonist again, raising his sword once more. However, the protagonist found this all too dramatic. After saying this, the orc suddenly froze in place. He had ended up being affected by that demon black ability, which Sang Hwan had acquired when he consumed his sword. The orc stood there, unable to move. The attack had almost hit the protagonist. Now, facing him directly, Sang Hwan told the orc to stay right there. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to test out his new move. As soon as he said that, the orc let out a roar, likely demanding that he stop. But the protagonist didn't stop. With a single movement, he sliced the orc's head clean off. As soon as he did, it flew toward the protagonist's group. The leader, who had previously underestimated the boy's strength, was shocked, but he also questioned how had this kid become so strong. He had only awakened 3 days ago, and the devastation was already happening here. The orcs, whom he once considered the strongest, had been ruthlessly taken down by this rookie. In the beginning, he even thought the best-ranked player would be 1.5 seconds faster, yet here he was, witnessing a total defeat. This dungeon, but he was different. His sword skill was quite remarkable, but the most important thing was whether he should be asking the professor if he already knew what kind of video on YouTube he had watched to become like that. The guys commented, "How did he manage to do that?" He also took down an armored orc, and to make matters worse, the guy had just awakened, not even 3 days ago. The answer comes to mind. Where did he get so many skills? And that, he still doesn't answer, because the protagonist looks at his system screen and sees that he has leveled up. So he opens his system screen, where it shows that he has fulfilled some conditions and received the title of Fearless Immature Dog. He doesn't even care much about his level, but the title he earned was quite surprising. Then he also takes a point he gained there and distributes his stats. At the moment, he knows which statistic he should be increasing. He learned this later in his other life, and at this point, he needed to put a few points into luck, because to him, it made more sense. While he was adjusting his stats, someone appears behind the leader, calling for him. Then he calls for Sang Hwan and starts asking about the skill he just used to kill those orcs. It was a skill called Obstacle, so he asks where he got that skill. He ended up regressing, and he is putting his skills to good use. To this, he reveals to the leader that he acquired this skill as soon as he woke up. The moment he says this, the leader approaches, and there he scolds the protagonist, because what he is saying doesn't make any sense. For that, he needed to answer with absolute certainty where he got that skill. He even asks if he is sure, especially since he doesn't have much luck. And he even has a diamond-class artifact. He could also verify it himself. The moment he grabs that sword, he opens his system screen and sees that the protagonist's sword wasn't a rare sword, but just a common greatsword. Throughout his life in this dungeon, it was the first time this had happened to him. But also, in the end, he didn't have a skill as good as that. Despite being at level 50, the actions of today would have consequences. However, while he was thinking about what he should do, someone calls for him. It was one of the adventurers who asked him to go see the boss of this place. Then another one appears and asks if the leader really wanted to go in there. He said yes, so they intended to go inside. But before he could do that, he turns to the protagonist and thanks him for killing the weaker orcs. But from now on, this skill he has will not be very useful, as they will now be facing the boss. The moment he says this, he turns to leave. The protagonist, on the other hand, ends up smiling. Only after smiling a little does he remember the real reason he had regressed. The leader gets closer and closer to the boss. However, we observe the protagonist from behind, saying what would happen if he alone defeated the boss of this place. One thing that will happen, the the protagonist will try to kill the boss, but in exchange, he will want one single thing from the boss. Of course, because killing the boss is very difficult, this thing was the artifact that the boss would drop on the ground. What he was looking for was the Carmine Stone, an artifact that can only be obtained by defeating a demon orc. That said, even after defeating hundreds of demon orcs, rumors say it is extremely difficult to obtain. In his past life, after his team managed to defeat a demon orc, his team was lucky enough to obtain this Carmine Stone. Sitting there, exhausted, he looks up, and that's when the monk appears holding that Carmine Stone. People asked where he got it. He didn't care about that, because if they put it up for sale on the black market, they would make a huge amount of money, since possessing the Carmine Stone is practically the artifact of delay ability. Upon hearing the word delay, he is surprised because that was the thing he needed for his ability to awaken, and he remembers it very well. From his memories, this team here makes everyone not even a team. In the end, the items that are dropped are divided among the whole team, but if by any chance they ask, would it be too arrogant to want to take the boss's main artifact? The leader, hearing this, remains silent, but he realizes that the important thing is that he needs to obtain this ability now, as it will be very useful for him in the future. But at this moment, he thinks that most people look down on new players. In the end, they are always seen as arrogant or something like that, and at the same time, no one ever really takes what the protagonist says seriously. Only after this does he ask himself what he was trying to do. He could clearly enter there, but he would die because he couldn't just assume he was strong just because he had killed some orcs. That was nothing. However, the leader asks him to calm down, and then the leader tells him to do whatever he wants. However, this would only happen if they failed to defeat the boss. Only then could he enter the dungeon on his own, kill the boss, and get the items for himself. And so, the whole group reorganizes to enter the dungeon. However, the protagonist needed to leave the team. He even thinks it's too easy, so he ends up saying that he needs to leave the battle. The group agrees with what he just said, and then he follows the path ahead to enter the boss's hall. The leader, at that moment, was irritated to see that this arrogant newbie was showing off too much. Just because he was new and strong, he thought he could be better than him. He wouldn't let that happen. To prove it, he would enter there and show the protagonist that combat experience is what truly matters. The protagonist might be arrogant, but the leader would show him who was really stronger. So he reaches the door and opens it. The moment he opens the door, he is surprised to find the boss inside. The boss was emanating that usual aura. Meanwhile, below, we see that they had just entered the boss's room. Among them, an orc gets furious, as this is a superior orc. Its classification was high. However, the whole group asks everyone to prepare because the battle would be more than worthy. And besides, they had a little trick to defeat this boss. They didn't need to worry. They just had to attack its weak points. To defeat it, they only had to keep circling. For a solo player, this was a joke. Sang Juan would basically be humiliated by this boss. So he tells his group to prepare. Only then does everyone run toward the boss. Just a minute later, he wakes up, not understanding anything, as he was easily knocked down. Now waking up, he gets up and asks himself what really happened. At first, the protagonist even thought they would be able to defeat the boss, but he didn't think they would be so stupid as to attack a monster like this head-on. Lying on the ground, he tries to get up, but one of his companions asks him to retreat. If he stayed here, they would all just die. But now, looking at this orc and those previous orcs, why were they so strong? Besides, he had even paid a good amount to get some basic tips from some people on how to defeat the boss easily. But in the end, it was almost useless. Now, he tells everyone to retreat. Sang Juan, immediately after, looks pleased. He smiles. The leader, looking at him, finds him a bit foolish. Another even thinks that maybe the protagonist could be strong. So, telling everyone to retreat once and for all, we see him passing by Sang Juan. Only then does he ask the protagonist to proceed. Only then could he finish off this boss. As he passes by, he tells him to finish the boss. If he didn't, then the leader himself would take care of the protagonist. The protagonist grips his great sword, then tells him not to worry. After all, today he needed this thing. If he died here, it would mean he was a failure. After holding his sword, he heads toward the boss. The boss, upon seeing him, starts running in his direction to catch him, but the protagonist stands still. After all, if he were to compare his strength to this orc's, he would never be able to defeat a monster like this. However, he wouldn't win with just his strength. There was something else that would really allow him to defeat this boss. It was only the experience he had gained over the time he lived in his past life. Only after he speaks about this does he manage to dodge one of the orc's sword strikes. As he dodges, we see that the orc does not take it well. The people behind him can't believe it. He managed to dodge a strike from this boss. The leader, who until now hadn't even been able to land a hit on the boss, is surprised to see that the protagonist managed to block a strike from this monster. And there goes Sang-gun, getting closer and closer to the boss. Walking towards victory, he will have to dodge all of the boss's attacks or evade his movements. However, as soon as he thinks about it, the stone on his chest begins to glow brighter and brighter. But to win, he will need strength, for he desires that crimson stone and will do anything to obtain it. The reason our protagonist is so obsessed with this stone is simple: the special effect it possesses. A delay, combined with that Blash Demon ability of his, would allow him to become stronger. He would be able to stun his opponents more easily. And to aid him even further, he has that ability of his, Devour. This Devour ability allows him to combine artifacts, making them increasingly powerful to the point where he can accumulate this skill by striking monsters. This will enable him to stun even stronger monsters, but with the combination of this gray stone, he could create a synergy that would grant him infinite stun against his enemies, and he wants that at any cost. To achieve this, he summons the presence of Or. Or, upon hearing this, does not simply stand still, listening to everything. He readies his axe, and as soon as he is prepared, he leaps in his direction. This was perfect. The crimson stone had come to him. Now, he could do what he had planned. He manages to execute a move, and with this movement, he inflicts an injury on the orc. As soon as he wounds the orc, its blood spills onto the ground. But to take advantage of this, he uses his paralysis ability, leaving the monster paralyzed for 2 seconds. The leader, witnessing all of this, is surprised. That ability? How did it work against a high-level orc like this? In response, he states that he knew orcs were simple, but this one was likely a demon orc. While they were talking, the orc prepared itself, and in the next moment, it lashed out with a powerful kick toward the protagonist. Sang-hwan saw this coming and quickly grabbed his sword, blocking the orc's kick and being pushed slightly backward. Gasping, he now realized that this orc was not playing around. That wound he inflicted earlier was quickly healed by the monster's regeneration ability. However, to stun this orc again, he would have to wait 15 seconds. He still had time, but he also noticed that stunning wouldn't help much. Since he wouldn't be able to keep it stunned indefinitely, he needed to defeat it. The orc, still advancing toward him, prepared its axe and attacked the protagonist. But with a swift movement of his great sword, he made the orc's weapon crash to the ground. As the battle raged on, the background character advised the leader to retreat, as staying there watching would be a mistake. That boy's ability wouldn't hold off this orc for much longer. The leader realized that his stun ability wouldn't work anymore. To make matters worse, there was a giant arcana surrounding this orc. But how could the protagonist remain so composed in the middle of a battle like this? The leader started to question whether this guy was really a rookie player. In the past, he had been through situations like this, and the truth was that the protagonist was still very weak. He needed to concentrate all his efforts on one point. He had to ignore the enemy's attacks. However, to win, he had to use the enemy's own strength against it. The monster lunged at him, and the protagonist simply smiled. With a precise upward sword movement, he managed to shatter that mark on the orc. Not only that, but he also managed to cut straight through the boss. Below, the system displayed a message showing that he had just leveled up multiple times. For accomplishing this feat, he had earned a new title. He was now a demon hunter. While hunting one of the strongest orcs, he once again looked at the system screen but ignored it. Now, he possessed 2 titles, 2 player titles. Perhaps this was the advantage of being a unique player. Looking ahead, he noticed that the group of players was still there. As he approached, they couldn't believe how this guy had managed to do such a thing. Usually, he just avoided annoying situations like this. There was only one thought in his mind. He shouted that he almost died in this battle, and if it weren't for the leader failing to even deal a single point of damage to the boss, he wouldn't have been able to defeat it. Upon hearing this, one of the background characters quickly praised his leader, stating that he had actually known the protagonist wouldn't succeed on his own, and it was all thanks to him. Looking more closely, they began to question what the protagonist was really trying to accomplish. In the end, the protagonist realized that this boy wasn't stupid. However, by observing him carefully, he understood that he was trying to say something with his expression. This was merely a mission he had to complete. Then, he whispered softly that this had been a complete defeat for him. He turned to his group and demanded their attention. Now that they had defeated the mid-boss, they needed to prepare to face the final boss. Now that it was over, he could finally leave. Everyone began to retreat, still talking about how that guy really shouldn't have been able to defeat such a boss. Now that everyone was gone, he looked at that stone. Finally, he could attempt to consume it, because as soon as he eats this, and he feels all the power entering inside him, and to devour the crimson stone, he enters that dimension of his. And the moment he enters that dimension, of course, he gets what he wanted so much. That's it. That crimson stone becomes a wonderful meal. In front of him appears a good mixture. He grabs that bowl, and only after that does he sit down and start eating. The texture of the food, to him, seemed more perfect than anything else. So he begins to eat, gaining some extra points. Besides the extra points, he also gains a skill. This is the delay ability. Now he can add a delay effect to his skills. But he wonders why. That was making him a little nervous. However, he could combine Demo Black with this new ability he obtained. And of course, by making this fusion, he gets some good points. Now, using this skill on any monster, the first attempt will have a 90% increase, the second 60%, and the last 30%. And after seeing all of this, the system expels him from that dimension, bringing him back to the original dimension. He is surprised. The total increase is guaranteed in 4 seconds. That is incredible. After all, in the beginning, he thought this was possible only theoretically. However, he wonders if this could work in another mode. But before he can do anything, Lair appears from behind and asks if he could talk to him. And so he tells him that his team was already facing the final boss, the Arbasaka. At this point, Sang Huan asks if he needed his help to defeat this boss, but he is surprised when he hears no. That leaves him shocked. But also, he would be a failed leader if he didn't use his protagonist as a member of his team. In the end, he asks him to join his team. However, Sang Huan, on the other hand, asks to leave the more dangerous things to him because that was what he enjoyed doing the most. But before he can continue, one of the team members appears, asking if they were ready to face the boss. The protagonist says yes, but he looks at the protagonist with a disgusted expression and asks him not to get too arrogant. However, they tell him to calm down because they were already in the final stretch. Leaving there, he arrives at dungeon number 85, the boss's chamber. At this moment, as they enter, we see the fierce boss. This boss was there, kneeling, but he wasn't kneeling because he wanted to surrender. It was because he hadn't even found a worthy opponent for the final boss. Now that they have entered this place, we see everyone ready to face this monster. The leader then asks Sang Huan to go first and deal with the monster, but the protagonist asks him to stay behind. Facing this boss, he notices something. This berserker boss has a very high weakness to stun abilities. So in the end, he realizes that defeating this boss will be easier for him than defeating any other boss. He won't have any problems at all. Then he starts running, but as he does, we see the berserker boss acting even faster. He rises and rushes toward him. Stopping for a moment, he starts thinking. Having such a thought was something he would never have in his past life. After all, in his past life, he was always afraid and always needed the help of the strongest ones. In the end, when he grew old, he had to become strong so that he could at least survive. But now this life will be a little different. Now, with the movement Pada, He repels the attack of this boss. Now he has a chance to change his future so that it won't be exactly like his past life. And to truly start changing his future, he needs to demonstrate a little more strength. He grips his sword. In his past life, no one wanted to watch him because he was an old man, and no one wanted to see an old man wielding a sword. But now, everyone watching simply stood there, frozen. Even the leader didn't interfere because he realized that this guy was a monster. With a single skill, he managed to use it against the boss and cut off a part of the monster. Then, he shouted for his team to deal with the rest of it. The boss would remain stunned for 4 seconds. The leader then ordered everyone in the group to advance because this was their chance. With the boss stunned, the group charged at him. At this moment, the boss couldn't do anything and was struck by multiple attacks. After taking down this orc, in the end, they managed to defeat him. Now that they had won, the system congratulated them for defeating the final boss and for managing to survive without dying. Now that everything was over, the protagonist was thinking of leaving when some porters approached and asked each other if the protagonist had a porter to help him collect items. They wanted to become the protagonist's porters. However, the protagonist replied that he wasn't really interested, mainly because he didn't want to do anything wrong with those porters. But while he was thinking about it, the system screen appeared, granting him new titles. He was surprised because, in his past life, he had never even dreamed of earning so many titles like the ones he was receiving now from the system. But even after obtaining so many titles, he still couldn't compare to that man. He was known as the Phantom Blade, the Title Collector, and the Complete Sword. In his past life, he was the strongest swordsman in Korea. At just 12 years old, he had earned multiple titles and was considered a monster. He quickly surpassed level 500. In his past life, he admired him. But now he could do things differently. Maybe now he could become that person. But to reach that level, he would need to speed up his evolution more and more. While he was lost in thought, the leader appeared, wondering what he was doing. He then replied that it was nothing. But in any case, the leader handed something to the protagonist, surprising him. He even asked why he was given that. But the leader said he deserved it. After all, it was just a bronze-class item, so he couldn't afford to be picky about keeping it. What he gave the protagonist wasn't something expensive, but rather something he gave because the two of them would probably never meet again. That thought hurt a little. He was already level 50, but he realized that this kid had more potential than he did. While everyone was leaving, they came across an adventurer who was furious. He had barely joined the team and yet received something he had always wanted. To him, this was unfair. He just wanted a little of the leader's attention, but he never got anything. He thought about doing something, but before he could, he was interrupted by a phone call. The scene then cuts to another location, a house where Sang-hoon is. We see him overjoyed now that he is a player. But what makes him truly happy is that he received a huge sum of money because he managed to clear the dungeon completely. Besides the bonus he received from the leader, he also got the Orc Berserker ring. Even though it was a bronze-class artifact, it was still surprising to see someone giving him an artifact that was quite decent for him. He understood that it was bronze, but most players would be without mana. Rue, upon launching his sword at the moment he repeats that phrase, ends up remembering that there was something there. He only discovered his greatest ability after 50 years. At that moment, he ended up devouring an artifact that required mana, but upon doing so, the results were quite shocking for him. The special effects of artifacts that require mana receive a penalty, but they lose their mana cost. At that moment, he grabs Baker's ring and now considers devouring it. After all, who would care about the penalty? Besides, the more abilities he had, the better for him. While he was devouring it, a commotion arose as that adventurer appeared, furious to see that guy defeat one of the strong bosses in just a few seconds. However, while he was shouting, he was surprised by another adventurer. Well, at first, he thought that everything the other was saying was just a way to set up revenge against the protagonist in the future. At first, the adventurer denied it, but in the end, He admitted that was exactly the case. He just wanted to do some business with him. Only after revealing everything did he give a slight smile. The moment he smiled, something happened. After that, another adventurer appears, questioning what they think he is. The price for doing that was way too low. If they really wanted him to hunt down the protagonist, the money had to go up. Otherwise, he wouldn't risk his life for anyone. However, after all that, the reward was increased. Only then did he ask where that guy was. The scene shifts to the protagonist climbing a mountain. Now that he had arrived, he stopped to rest a bit. However, he ended up feeling nauseous after eating some things that didn't sit well with him. But aside from those small negatives, he always believed there had to be light at the end of the tunnel. The sword he held gave him a great advantage. At the moment, he decided to just hold on to that sword with nothing else to do. The protagonist thought of a way to take action. He opened the system screen and saw his first mission. His first task was to attract the attention of constellations. As a player, he could have a constellation, but choosing one required a lot of care. He needed to pick a constellation that contributed to the ability he currently possessed. Most likely, he had nothing else he could do. After all, he didn't know which constellation he should choose. So now he opted for training. He got into his car, accelerated, and arrived at another location. Stopping there, we see his bored expression. He was disappointed, because if he kept going like this, he would die of exhaustion. He spent several days training non-stop. However, after so much effort, he gained a new ability, one that allowed him to improve infinitely with any kind of sword. Any sword he picked up could turn him into a true sword master. Now he finally found a unique dungeon. He was happy to have found one, but at the same time, he was frustrated because he had driven an enormous distance to get there. However, he ignored all that, but something caught his attention. A black car in the background that made no sense. At that moment, he realized that those idiots had been following him for a long time. But for now, he didn't know what to do about those people. He decided to ignore them for a bit and deal with the dungeon first. But then, as soon as he entered the portal, the people who had been following him also appeared. Upon entering, he began to wonder if this wasn't a dungeon meant for a single player. Inside, we find the protagonist sitting on a unique stone. After all that, he revealed that they couldn't have entered the wrong dungeon. This dungeon belonged to him. He asked them all to leave. He wouldn't report anyone, but now, looking more closely, he realized that the group doesn't even have a single healer or mage. He realizes that they discarded the best possibilities to clear the dungeon efficiently, a group made up only of swordsmen. He already recognizes this. They are a type of party specialized in hunting humans. However, because he pointed this out earlier, they got irritated with the protagonist and asked him to leave. But it was no use. He wouldn't leave either way. From now on, he wouldn't be leaving here alive. In his past life, these guys existed, but they were completely eradicated by the constant surveillance of the Players Association. However, he was well aware of this. To eliminate this group, he had to deal with the archer first. The archer was the most difficult to handle, but before that he commented that this was exactly what needed to be done before anything else began. He had already taken care of 4 bodies, and the place he chose was specific for them. As soon as he said this, the players got even more irritated with the protagonist. But another one told him to stop because, after all, he was just messing with their heads. Fighting together was better for them. However, at that moment, irritated, one of them said he could handle the protagonist alone. But Sang-gun told him to listen to his boss. Otherwise, he would die. Yet, the moment he said this, he only got more irritated. Now, he acted first, charging toward the protagonist with his sword in hand, telling him to go to another world. The protagonist simply watched, but survival in the dungeon depended on who adapted best. The monsters were always after their lives inside the dungeon. Even artifacts could betray them, leading to death. Life in the dungeon was always a risk, and the weakest always died. There were no rules in the dungeon. In the dungeon, the strongest won, and to do so, it was necessary to kill the strongest to survive. This was exactly what he had experienced in his past life, but this also applied to this era. And as a result, what happened here to him meant only one thing. self-defense. After taking down one of the adventurers, he told the next one to come at him and not just stand there. As soon as he said that, two of them rushed at the protagonist. The protagonist just observed, but before he could do anything, he told them to spread out a bit more. He needed the archer to protect the others so they could find the perfect position to attack him. The archer understood. The archer, taking position, realized that he managed to kill Sangoon. Even though he was an idiot, he had reached this level. And to make things even worse, he had only recently awakened his power. While he kept talking about this, he was just filming the protagonist holding that sword. But then they asked where he was going. However, irritated, the archer told him to shut up, shooting some arrows in his direction. The protagonist, seeing the arrows coming at him, simply decided to move. His movement was fast. Then he managed to cut those arrows in half. The archer just watched it all. However, with nothing else to do, he ended up getting caught by the protagonist's sword. One of the bystanders watched this, even freezing for a moment. He saw that the adventurer had thrown his sword like a spear. Looking more closely, this guy seemed a bit different from before. Then, the protagonist ran toward his sword. The kid had thrown his weapon away and had no way to defend himself. This was the perfect moment to attack him. Noticing this, he stopped for a moment and told his friend beside him to attack the protagonist immediately. While they were thinking about stopping to attack the protagonist, he decided to run toward the sword that was stuck in the adventurer. Meanwhile, the two rushed toward him even faster. What they didn't want to happen, happened. The protagonist swung his hand. As soon as he swung, he finally reached his sword. But the moment he grabbed it, he looked to the side, where the two adventurers were ready to attack him. Then, the two of them moved in to cut down the boy. But they were in for a surprise. With a single movement, he quickly dodged their attacks. They are surprised. They don't believe it. But the protagonist realizes that this was a close call. On his sword, we see the two of them praising him. He was fast. But now that he has held the sword, he pulls it out from there, and only after doing so does he prepare to launch an attack toward that boss. However, before he can do so, we see the boss grabbing his companion's head. He wonders what he was doing, but what comes next is a slash, a stroke coming from the protagonist. But instead of hitting the boss, it struck that guy instead. He basically went to another world. Now that he has taken down one of his companions, the protagonist realizes something. Thinking for a moment, he considers that everyone here might actually be some kind of org dealer. After all, no matter how much he thinks about it, everyone in this group wouldn't even have the chance to work together. Their objective has always been to seek out strong adventurers. Their goal is to defeat strong adventurers and obtain some important points to apply to themselves, allowing them to level up much faster in a highly illegal way. He reveals that he can no longer lie, but what he says ends up almost confirming it anyway. He has seen a lot in the past, and now none of that means anything anymore. So, he prepares his sword and charges toward the protagonist. At this moment, the protagonist is defenseless and could now be dying. But before he can continue, the protagonist asks him to wait just a moment. Then he activates that Demon Blash ability, which instantly paralyzes him. At the beginning of the fight, he was a little afraid that this battle might be boring, but in the end, it wasn't so bad. However, now the system displays that the player will be stunned for 4 seconds. Shocked, he wonders how he ended up stunned. Then, he remembers. It was those small cuts that our blood Juan had inflicted on him when he defeated his other companion. But now that he looks more closely, this was impossible. There is no such ability in this world. However, for the protagonist, none of this matters anymore because everything is over now. Overcome with fear, he starts sweating. They ask if he will die just like that. He has always been the one who kills, and it has always been that way. Just like last time, he went after an adventurer, an interesting one. The guy actually believed in him quite a lot, but in the end, he was betrayed. Lying on the ground, he asks why he did this. As he gets closer, the truth is revealed. He was never even an adventurer. He was one of those guys who hunted adventurers. In the end, his time had come. With his great sword in hand, the protagonist simply slashes through his throat. In the end, he met a tragic fate. In the river, he washed away all that blood, and with that, he could finally continue farming his XP in a more efficient way than before. While he was doing the clean work of cleaning the sword, he kept thinking, what if something happened to him? If the police came after him? Until then, he thought that what he did was just self-defense. However, now that he was cleaning it, he turned to the side, where he had a surprise: the weapons left behind by those adventurers. There were other artifacts on the ground, and the protagonist could be picking up each of those artifacts and entering that dimension. Between the dimensions, he could be devouring each of them. Because at that moment, he even thinks that this equipment down here means that it is all his. He has nothing else to do since the people who owned it are no longer here in this world. So there is no one else to take care of them. The protagonist puts on his coat and smiles, showing confidence or satisfaction. The system reveals Shin Sang-yun, level 10, and title with overwhelming power. Zrenya informs that his constellation devours artifacts, and he has consumed 11. The system concludes with HP 400, MP 50, and EXP 12. He has strength 37, and stamina, mana, evasion, and defense 20, and dexterity 28, and luck 19. Attributes displayed in the status menu. Our boy regrets the situation but analyzes the results and concludes that it was worth it. He considers himself strong as level 50 players and questions the time since his return. The protagonist announces that he has something more to say and seems to be about to reveal something important. He picks up a shiny ring, admiring it. The system informs that the Ring of Recovery is a silver artifact and support equipment. It explains that the ring uses 10 mana to immediately clear abnormalities, and that if used again within a minute, the mana consumed doubles. The protagonist talks about the initial attack and questions who would have thought he would have an artifact to remove abnormalities. He acknowledges that relying too much on the stun almost harmed him, and promises to be more cautious in the future. The system announces the beginning of the mana synchronization of the Ring of Recovery. The goblins are in the mine and are walking along the tracks. One of them notices something and reacts with a grunt expressing "Grr!" The protagonist wields his sword and is surrounded by goblins facing them in combat. He exclaims "Phew" and walks, holding a large sword, thinks it's crazy because the title Lucky Day requires killing 500 monsters with their eyes closed. The goblins growl and question the event while holding their weapons. The creature shows teeth and looks surprised, and an exclamation reveals his reaction. The protagonist, holding a shining sword, asks when monsters will attack and shows preparation for the imminent confrontation. The goblin shows his sharp teeth. Our boy says he can feel their presence and is surprised. He holds his sword. He needs to feel the air and listen carefully, as this is crucial for his perception and action. Focuses and holds the long sword, as he needs to maintain the present state. He hears the drops of water falling. The protagonist turns white hair and shows seriousness and concentration. He falls into the darkness and seems to be in free fall. Our boy is confident that he can handle the situation and remains confident. The goblin growls and wields his axe, showing his sharp teeth. Sang-hwang fights bravely and cuts enemies, and blood gushes as he advances in combat. Blood starts raining everywhere. Protagonist wields his sword on the battlefield. The protagonist smiles and says that this looks good. Fast and impactful launch. The protagonist sees an object coming and is surprised. He wields the sword skillfully and says he thinks he has gotten the hang of it. Sang-hwang fires the arrow and the trajectory is accurate. The goblin growls and wields a bow, showing himself to be threatening. The protagonist recounts a recent terrible situation and says he was in trouble. He recalls the past and sharpens his senses and concludes anyway. Sang-hwang summons his enemies and wields a weapon, challenging them to confrontation. The goblins attack furiously and advance with momentum. The protagonist attacks and cuts enemies around him, and one of them screams when he is hit. He smiles sinisterly as he cuts something with a blade. The attack is fast and precise. One of them is surrounded by enemies and growls, while the others scream. The sword is covered in blood. The system says he has leveled up. He is on a battlefield with bodies all around him, and informs him that he has obtained the title D rank, Lucky Day. The protagonist says that it doesn't seem like he has done much, and smiles from the corner of his eye, holding a coat. The system reveals Lucky Day, a D rank title that increases luck by 20, and when defeating monsters of the same type, luck increases by 0.1, but with a cap of 10. Sang Huang wins titles and smiles, but a sound of rage arises, foreshadowing conflict. One of them growls and bares sharp teeth, and the tension rises. He grunts while surrounded by goblin bodies. He is holding a giant arm. The protagonist says he will take the chance to gain some extra stats. He smiles. Then, the protagonist had a somewhat serious expression, only afterwards saying, "Why not take this chance to also earn some extra points?" The goblins that were around, of course, were a little afraid, but minutes later he got what he wanted, some points. He earned them, which made our protagonist start laughing, but not in a good way. Instead, it was because everything he did would earn him a huge amount of money in the future, and his eyes already showed all of that. This ability ended up somewhat increasing our protagonist's chances by 30%. Maybe, by maintaining this thing now, he could be getting 500 million, no, maybe 1 billion. While happily commenting on how much money he would be earning, a portal crack appeared behind him. However, he didn't care about that, because at that moment he finally wanted to be recognized by everyone. But as he slowly turned around, he saw a glow behind him. His eyes widened because minutes later the system appeared, stating that 3 constellations had come to him. Below, their names were displayed. The cleaner of a fallen dimension was asking if he was interested in becoming his ally. The Grand Wanderer ended up making the same request. Lastly, the Goddess of Luck smiled at him before extending her hand, wanting to make him one of her allies. The protagonist, seeing all of this, simply stared at the 3 constellations wanting him. And incredibly, these 3 constellations had united to claim our protagonist for themselves. All 3 of them were fast, but 3 of them had come to see the protagonist, which left him quite surprised. He even asked if, by any chance, they had liked his performance just now. Then, one of the constellations approached him, making our protagonist initially a little uncomfortable. He even thought that perhaps he had been a bit too arrogant, such a thing he had never even experienced in his past life. But then, this constellation started saying some things to our protagonist. Was he, by any chance, interested in forming an alliance with the Goddess of Luck? After all, this Goddess of Luck was fascinated by him because she had never seen a swordsman with such great luck, leaving our hero once again somewhat uncomfortable. He even commented that he really did have a lot of luck. Well, now it seemed that these constellations were truly interested in making a contract with him. Still, he should conduct a more comfortable verification of this. He started looking at the caretaker of the corrupt dimension. This was the caretaker of the corrupt dimension, considered a type of assassin. Perhaps what he had just done had caught his attention, since he managed to kill many goblins in a short period of time. Below there was also the pig that wanders through the great universe, but he didn't understand why it had appeared for him. He had heard that Celestials only appeared to players with a saintly disposition, but he ended up supposing that her appearance was because of him, and looking at her face, that was indeed the case. Among the Celestials, she was said to be quite popular, but at that moment, as he was talking about this, the Goddess of Luck turned in his direction, and then said that the Goddess of Luck had no sense of exclusivity. She also emphasized that he could still make other choices, even selecting other Celestials, which made our protagonist quite happy, because it seemed like an incredible advantage. A shooter who could fire arrows that stopped in midair and still hit his target with precision, with the blessing of the world, never ran out of arrows. This was known as the miraculous shooter. These were the greatest praises for archers, and they were all directed at Hemoth. The reason was his luck stat, which was extremely high, combined with destructive power. Some people even started suspecting that he was a bit of a scam or fraud. However, it seemed specific. In reality, he simply had 2 Celestials with him, Hemoth, along with the one who made the impossible possible. No one else had ever managed to do that. That was the goddess of luck. But for 3 celestials to appear all at once, the guy even felt shy about it. Below, we found 3 little monsters wanting the protagonist as an ally. The young man kept thinking about what he should choose. The Celestials urged him to put aside such trivial concerns and practically demanded that he make his choice. At that point, one of the Celestials even wondered if they had misjudged the person. But the protagonist started realizing that these Celestials were very concerned with things that weren't really worth it. But now, looking a little closer, the god of luck, in other opinions, was a good choice. However, if he chose this one, there was a possibility that no other Celestial would ever appear to him again in the future, since the decision he was making here and now would change the rest of his life forever as a player. In the last 10 years as a player, only one Celestial had appeared to the protagonist. This one had been a student of the arduous development model, but, believe it or not, his appearance had literally been a ray of salvation, and the protagonist was quite happy to have him by his side now, even though he had obtained that Celestial rather late. He even believed that his future from then on would be more than brilliant. But the future he had so long awaited and dreamed of eventually arrived, and only then did he realize that nothing had changed. When he reached the final years, at the age of 55, nothing had happened in his life that had completely transformed it. For some reason, he had never been granted any benefits by a Celestial. This was a reason. This was an absolutely ridiculous prerequisite. To make matters worse, he had not even been able to use the most important power of a Celestial as a player. Not only that, but he had never even thought of using such a thing. And well, in the end, he had probably ended up regressing because of that Celestial. Should he be grateful to him then? Now he needed to be much more cautious. Otherwise, the same thing would happen again in his future. If at the age of 55 he turned out to be a failure, he most likely wouldn't be able to obtain divine power, destruction power, or luck power. Which one should he choose? His mind was a mess. But in the end, he ended up thinking of only one way out, choosing one of the Celestials. The moment he thought of this, he pressed the selection button, and the system appeared above, stating that the contract with the Celestial had been finalized. This was the god of luck. The contract was formed, and once established, it would remain intact even if the player were to die within the next 30 years. Now, a dimensional presence would be watching over the protagonist in his adventures. It advised him to be a little more careful, because now San Juan had the goddess of luck right by his side. Then, the system congratulated the protagonist. 3 other Celestials had sworn to ensure that their sponsored players would achieve enormous growth. This made San Juan more at ease. He even wondered why he was receiving so much attention. But in any case, from now on, he would be under the care of this goddess. The goddess of luck extended her hand and took the protagonist's hand. In that moment, she acknowledged him as one of her allies. Upon accepting him, the system displayed new information. With each attack landed on his opponent, a critical hit would be added. Additionally, when acquiring a high-grade artifact, the hidden effect would always be unlocked and inherited. When eliminating mini-boss monsters, there would be a chance to obtain a very high-ranking artifact. At that moment, seeing all this information appear before him, he was surprised. Until now, he had never been able to see such things, but even that was not enough. If he leveled up, he would continue increasing his luck stats, critical hit rate, and drop rate. Looking at the system now, he couldn't believe what he saw. His critical hit rate was at 100%, his accuracy was at 100%, and artifact drops were guaranteed. In the past, San Juan had suffered greatly, but now he would never suffer again. However, the goddess of luck asked the protagonist what he planned to do about the offers from the other Celestials. At that moment, he requested that the 2 who were still present leave, as he no longer needed them. Upon being dismissed, the other Celestials became angry with the protagonist. One of them issued a threat, while the Devourer also made a menacing remark toward him. On the other hand, the god of the underworld applauded him, saying that his strong sense of self was quite remarkable, making them like him even more. But the Goddess of Luck said that, with these effects now in place, there was no need to be greedy for the time being. He also needed to be patient, as better opportunities would arise in the future. Meanwhile, in the hall, the protagonist now found himself in a good situation, but not entirely. He was now facing an opponent with strong sword movements. He defended against each strike, leaving the Goddess of Luck quite surprised as he countered every attack from the final boss. If by any chance this was the final boss, if this was all he could do at his maximum, the boss, upon hearing this, only grows more irritated. So, he grabs his now more powerful axe and manages to defend himself from the protagonist's strike. Only then does he stop, as now the system screen appears, stating that the floor boss has become enraged at the boy. Then, with a unique axe movement, he throws the protagonist backward. The protagonist uses his sword to stop himself, but the floor boss remains furious, letting his rage take over. However, this rage that was consuming him moves toward the protagonist. This thing is considered a type of status ailment. He realizes that what has reached him is the disease of intimidation. Our protagonist finds this a bit foolish, but this ability used by the goblin is not as lethal as the paralysis skill. However, it is still dangerous, as the immense pressure weighing down on him is enormous. For some reason, this goblin is trying to break his fighting spirit. So, he needs to use recovery. At this moment, the goblin is attacking our protagonist, but at the last second, Sang Juan jumps to the side. The goblin then strikes, curious to see if he hits Sang Juan, only to be surprised. Sang Juan has managed to defend himself from the goblin. After everything, he discovers a weakness in this ability. At best, this goblin simply uses this skill to deal with small mobs, which gives the protagonist a little more confidence. Now, he needs to finish off this boss as quickly as possible while also testing his new ability. Fortunately, he was able to remove the disease of intimidation that had been cast upon him by the boss. As soon as he dispels this intimidation, we see the boss completely shocked. Then, we see the protagonist charging at the goblin, and minutes later, he manages to cut it in half. The goblin even tries to use the intimidation skill again, but this time it won't work. Since he loves to paralyze others with pressure, why not do the same to him? For 2 whole seconds, the boss is paralyzed, and that is more than enough. The protagonist turns back with his sword in hand and delivers multiple cuts. In 2 seconds, he completely takes down the boss, but instead of finishing him off entirely, he uses delay. With this ability, he can hold the boss's life force a little longer, allowing him to advance and deal more damage. Once again, he uses the delay effect. Now, there is a 90% chance of triggering the stun ability, which leaves the protagonist completely surprised. And our story will now continue from where we left off. There, our protagonist managed to do what he wanted as soon as he defeated the boss. The boss simply fell beside our hero while he just stood still, wondering if he had really succeeded. But he had, because the boss ended up collapsing to the ground. Meanwhile, Chico held his large greatsword. After a little while, the system appeared, giving those beautiful congratulations for having managed to take down a very powerful boss. Moreover, it rewarded him with some XP and a few more levels. He then sighed, but also ended up acquiring something new. It was the title of HZ. After receiving it, he sighed again and shouted that it was finally over, while falling to his knees in front of the boss. He felt completely exhausted, especially because earlier he had groups of people following him, but now he was in this completely unknown dungeon. This made him think that he was pushing his body too hard. However, the Goddess of Luck, on the other hand, thought that she was basically giving him the best of the best if he happened to complete some missions. Something that our protagonist understood as her considering him a madman for getting himself into situations like this. But the Goddess of Luck, on the other hand, said that everything he had done was just the basics, since he now had the total luck ability. When she said that, it left our protagonist quite surprised. But his priority now was to focus on leveling up his abilities. The first was to increase his luck a little more. When he checked his system's statistics, he realized that his luck was slightly above normal. Here he explained something to us, that when an attribute exceeds 100, any type of bonus-related effect ends up being increased by 10%. To give an example, his evasion attribute also ended up increasing, which gave him the advantage of being able to obtain some good items. He looked down and found a shield that had dropped after the boss's death. Upon checking its statistics, it seemed that the shield he had just acquired wasn't anything amazing, but he didn't mind. After all, with the goddess of luck by his side, it was very likely that he would obtain much better items. In the future, however, he realizes one thing. If he increases his luck stat, it is very likely that his artifact drop rate will improve. So he ends up synchronizing a bit more mana into luck, and as soon as he does that, the goddess of luck sticks close to him, meaning that the low-grade artifact will improve slightly. But while he was thinking about how to enhance this, the scene cuts to another place, and in this place, we find a receptionist who suddenly starts talking. However, she was not talking to our protagonist. Yet, our protagonist ends up asking her to reconsider things a bit more, since his purposes and thoughts were basically in his mind. Still, she feels quite bad, and begins to think that he should reconsider a little more. But as soon as she mentions this, he starts to think that he had just seen some bodies around. And for some reason, he cannot let this prevent him from doing the things he wants to do. While he was thinking about what to do to solve this situation, the scene cuts to another location. A few hours later, we see him in his car, driving around happily, because with the shield he managed to get from that goblin, he earned some things. Now he can eat, and he even thinks about what kind of rice he will eat today. But while driving, he suddenly feels a tremor in his car. He stops and asks what is going on until he notices some lights in the car, a sign that poor people cannot have happiness. Realizing that his car was barely holding together and could break down at any moment, he considers buying a new one, as this one would not last much longer in his hands. But while thinking about which cars to get, he starts to believe it is not a good idea, as it would be embarrassing. His current level was not very high, and he would only get involved in more dangerous situations. What if, by accident, he ends up in debt and the guys from the bank come after him? Besides, he cannot take living in constant fear anymore. He then starts to think about moving to the city of players, where surveillance is constant, and all the artifacts he currently needs are there. At that moment, he begins to consider a few things. He also needs to buy used equipment to make things a bit easier for himself, but he stops to think. However, there is one thing he needs, one thing more important. That was money. And right now, he needs a lot of money. And there is only one place where he can earn money. The system was created along with the era of players, and with its emergence came missions. An organization basically manages missions to give players wealth and money, but they call it the Players Association. With no other way out, he starts to think about a system controlled by the Players Association and realizes that he really should go through with it. So he asks to be waited for, as he will be arriving at the mission arena. He speeds up his car, but he does not get very far, as his car was already on its last legs. Back in the present, he cannot believe he is being stopped at the entrance, but she asks him to wait a little while, as he could enter a dungeon suitable for him. Moreover, she is surprised as to why he is trying to enter a level 100 dungeon. For that, he asks her to trust him. After all, he will not cause any trouble. Even though he is just some level 17 guy, he cannot do low-ranking missions, as it would be a waste of time for him. With the feeling of wanting to cry at the same time as looking at the guy's face, she only asks again, so the guy would at least go to a certain place where there were lower-ranking missions. Besides, he even understood her, that many people who were level 17 also tried to enter higher-ranking dungeons, and many of them died. But he couldn't just give up now. He needed to stay strong. However, while he was thinking about what to do, someone appeared in the background asking what was going on there. The receptionist, on the other hand, said it was nothing. She ended up kind of calling for him, and at that moment, she activated that sobriety of hers and realized that his level was also level 100. She was a rank S player, and the moment he saw her, he ended up remembering a few things about Kimis. She was a sharpshooter with a precision bow. She was the first player to reach level 100 and earned the title of sharpshooter. Although her skills were incredible, what really made her stand out was that she was the daughter of the president of a biotechnology company. But what does that really mean? Kimis, the Shadow Assassin, is also known by his title as one of the greatest assassins in the nation. But there are also the Swordsmen, who are known as some of the greatest swordsmen in the X-Nation. John is from the same guild, but Eden is the shareholder affiliate of the Eden Guild Corporation. In other words, she was born with the silver spoon in her mouth, having everything good and the best. While he was amazed by this, she ended up commenting that she had never seen the protagonist before. At first, she was just observing our hero, basically trying to convince her to allow him to enter an S-rank dungeon, which also piqued her interest since she wondered why he wanted to enter an S-rank mission. After hearing this from her, he simply told her that he needed money. But as soon as he said that, a background character appeared, asking who that guy talking to Kimis was. However, others asked them not to point at him, especially since that guy was crazy, so they asked to leave him alone. Besides, that girl was being nice to a newbie like him. But Kimis stood over our hero and ended up saying that the dungeon he wanted to enter was dangerous. But for him it was fine since he was already used to it. At that moment, he only heard a few words from those people. The danger level was high, but he was already aware of that. But at this moment, he remembered that in the past, he had tried to join her group, but, he was weak back then, and she ended up rejecting him. Even though he had been rejected before, he couldn't hold a grudge about it. But still, even if he wasn't fully aware of things, he couldn't proceed with missions there since he would need a group, and playing solo wasn't allowed. But as soon as she brought up this subject, we saw him surprised, especially since he started thinking about some things. The mission and solo bans would only be lifted in another 4 years. So at that moment, our protagonist simply laughed and realized that he had been looking at the wrong information all along, and it was very likely that he wouldn't be able to enter there. So he ended up apologizing and leaving, but before he could leave, she started talking about something. It was about whether he might be interested in going on an adventure with her. But as soon as she said that, everyone wondered if that was serious. At that moment, they started to feel a little jealous and began to wonder who that boy was. But he ended up saying that he would need a condition, which surprised her quite a bit, seeing that she wanted to help the player, but in return, he wanted some extra conditions. He simply said that he was a newbie, and moreover, he had a hard time trusting people. But unfortunately, she didn't have any conditions. Instead of conditions, she only asked him to make a promise, that if he disappointed her, it was very likely that he will pay a high price for it. But if by any chance he stands by his words, she will most likely apologize for her actions against our hero. At this moment, he ends up understanding, and it is quite likely that she was just testing the boy. With a smile, we see that he was really taking this thing a little more seriously. But Kimson's influence is not simply to be the best player in any gear she uses. That doesn't even trigger because anything that comes out of her mouth kind of turns into dozens of articles. But there were also rumors going around about the person she likes the most. She likes the kind of person who doesn't go around saying they like just anyone. After all, those types of people who are known as confident players are practically destroyed in Kimson's presence. But if Kimson really wants to see his real power, our protagonist is willing to do it. He even invites her right away so that he could be there to fight soon because things would get interesting. And so, the scene cuts to another day. She says goodbye to her guide and ends up asking that he not go through there anymore because she will be taking care of personal matters. She also comments that although her guild is always full, it is a nuisance, but she is looking for some members to participate in some raids with her. And so, when she enters this place, she ends up encountering our protagonist so that she could trust him. And this is the moment when Mayon practically had a reason for Sang-Yun, our protagonist, to win her over. After all, in the middle of a rather crazy situation up ahead, she ended up finding a confident player in a situation where no one knew players like these were capable of achieving great performance. Now, looking directly at the protagonist, they both realize that things here seem quite important to her as well. But Kimson interrupts everything and ends up asking that girl what mission Sang-Yun will be participating in. She stops to wait for the moment and only later shows her which mission he will be undertaking. Looking at it now, she is surprised since it wasn't a collection mission. It was a defense mission. Since this type of mission requires you to defeat all the monsters approaching to complete it, there is always a general rule to always have at least one ranged damage dealer in a group of 4 people. Now she was surprised because he would be doing it alone. If she were here, he would basically be dead. Observing this whole situation, our protagonist even asks if, by any chance, she was nervous. After all, she started to become quiet and began to tremble. So, he ended up thinking she was nervous. If it was too much, he even considers gathering some people, maybe a damage dealer or perhaps a tank or other options. But she interrupts, grabbing his hand and holding it tightly. She points towards the system screen and says that the problem wasn't that since Sang-Yun would be participating in a dungeon that was completely impossible to pass alone. But anyway, for basically mocking her, she accepts. And as soon as the mission was chosen, the portal would appear, and he would be sent to the mission. The receptionist from before ends up sweating all over and only later says that if Kimson is together with that guy, then nothing bad will be happening now that that guy is gone. They start wondering if he will be able to get another discard. It was impossible since he was level 17. How was he supposedly going to deal with level 100 monsters? Besides, that player might be weak, but there's that mission where Kimson, who is a ranker hunter, is involved. But it seems that perhaps her judgment of them seems to be a little harsh. But they end up interrupting and ask if by any chance they know about the ranking system that was recently revised by the Players Association. So it ends up confirming that they know these things. And one of the first things when judging a person by their strength or appearance is thinking they are weak. But in the end, they are not, since there are still conditions to achieve a higher rank. First, the dungeon number has to be completed. Second, the general evaluation of a player should be about the person's combat abilities. But the meaning of which mission receives the highest classification means that they are ranking it because, in a dungeon fight, she manages to finish a dungeon ranked as easy. However, having a rank means almost nothing. Still, he ends up explaining that there are monsters with a higher classification than hers, but he says that this does not matter for now, especially because they are not on a mission. This means that she entered along with that guy into the dungeon alone. They wanted to be there with her too. But while they were commenting on this, our scene changes to another location. It's a defense area for their mission. From above, we see lightning coming from a tall tower on top of a rock. We find our mission here, where she is just observing the words. It is very likely that, with responsibility, if things get really dangerous, she will obviously help. But something she says ends up making our protagonist laugh at her from a distance. And only after does he comment that, after the experience she will have here, he at least hopes she will wake up a bit to reality. But 30 minutes earlier, we see her wondering what he was doing. And to this, he responds by asking what exactly she means by what he said before, up until now. At that moment, he asks for no interference, and then he continues, saying that if she concentrates strangely on support, he will be giving 5%. And no, he did not hear wrong, because the finesse dungeon will be giving 5% of everything they earn inside, since she is just support. But she ends up thinking he was a little afraid because of some conditions she mentioned to him before. Still, she will interfere anyway, because there is no way he will be able to handle this alone. At least, if he were at level 300, he would not lose everything, and even though she is at level 100 for him, it would be almost impossible to complete the mission alone. And at this moment, as they talk about this, she turns to the side and sees the protagonist, who just asks her to stay in the background and observe. But she sighs and then says that every mistake he makes there will be 1% less of what he will receive, and if he misses 95% of the monsters, he will not receive anything. And as she says this, one of the monsters appears. However, not just one shows up, but actually two irritated monsters. Meanwhile, on the other side, we see our protagonist apologizing a little, and now he asks the little creatures to come at him. He then grabs his sword and drops it on the ground, which is enough to crack the entire floor. The wolves end up feeling a bit scared. Moreover, he says that he will not lose sight of a single monster. As these monsters head toward him, while all of this happens, she is just watching from behind. The wolves charge forward, and we then see our protagonist cutting down the three that came at him. With his large sword, our hero easily managed to cut each one of them. And the moment he sliced through them, he just kept moving forward. As he advanced, the monsters behind him all fell to the ground, defeated. Our protagonist, still carrying his sword, ends up praising the screams. While he was fighting the monsters, for some reason, she found the way they moved cute. But as she thought about it, the scene flashed back to the past. Now, looking more closely, she realized that he wasn't just an overconfident player. After all, that last attack was relentless. His stance was completely advantageous, which gave him a significantly greater range. In addition, in their guild, there was a swordsman known as Jay, who always said, "Offense and defense are one and the same." He minimized unnecessary movements and was able to take down multiple enemies with a single strike. To be so confident, he must have been quite bold, especially considering the overwhelming amount of monsters in front of him. However, his level was only 1, and it didn't seem like he could handle so many enemies alone. On the other hand, she wondered if she could help him. The moment he used the skill Stun L, the wolves' movements immediately stopped. Upon realizing this, she was shocked to see that he had a paralysis ability. Still surprised, she decided to jump to the top of a building, but lost some of her balance and almost fell. Meanwhile, the scene returns to the protagonist, who was using all his power during the fight. She realized that this was dangerous, but she couldn't care about anything else because he had used the paralysis ability, and she counted exactly 4 minutes of duration. This meant that he could paralyze the monsters long enough to defeat them quickly. Once again, she asked herself, "Who is this guy?" While this doubt hovered in her mind, the fight continued. During the fight, something surprised the protagonist. One of the wolves was thrown forward by an unknown force. He remained still, watching a wave of wind approaching. Finally, the black wolf appeared. This wolf had a strange power. With every step it took, the monsters around it fell dead. When it opened its mouth, it let out a deafening roar. In her past life, the protagonist had never faced a monster like that, but she felt a strange sense of familiarity. However, this soon became a problem, as the black wolf used the same paralysis skill, Stun, on her. Now she was immobilized for a few minutes. As she thought of a way to escape, the scene returned to her. One of the rays emitted by the wolf headed towards her, but before she was paralyzed, she used a special skill to nullify the effect. This attack brought her back to reality, and she realized that she had lost all concentration. While thinking about how she could help the protagonist, she also pondered how a player of such a low level could escape this paralyzing skill. However, the protagonist used a new system skill that removed the stun. As soon as he freed himself, he charged at the wolf, surprising the girl even more. In addition to using perfect posture while wielding a great sword, he managed to nullify the effect of the paralysis on his stats. For a level 16 player, this was considered impossible. When he approached the wolf, the protagonist noticed something curious. The wolf, which had previously seemed so powerful, was now completely paralyzed. Apparently, he had believed that the protagonist would remain immobile under the effect of the stun, but the situation had reversed. Now, the one who was stunned was the black wolf, while the hero prepared for the next decisive blow. Sliding to the ground, and at this moment, our protagonist can even feel the panic in the wolf's gaze, and panicking here means the result of the battle. He grabs the sword and ends up piercing the wolf, and by sliding, he manages to stab the wolf entirely from behind. Literally, his stand ability ended up surpassing the stand on the other side, and in the end, when he managed to bring down the wolf, it falls on top of our hero. Now that he has taken down a monster like this, some of the monster's blood stains his clothes, but since that's the case, he might as well make some messes to have a little fun. Meanwhile, on top of the building, we find our Kimso completely happy. At the moment, she wasn't happy for our hero himself, but was wondering intensely who on earth our hero could be. But to really find out, we'll only discover everything in the next part, as today's video is coming to an end. But before I go, leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this new chapter, and will she apologize in front of our hero? Also, before I leave, don't forget to drop a like below. But now, I think I'll be heading out. Maybe I'll see you around, or I'll just meet you in the next part.